In Bram Stoker's original novel, Dracula, the Count is described as a monster. He is repellent and wolf-like. His looks are described as unattractive, hard, and cruel. He is a predator, a villain with purely evil intentions. In the earliest cinematic versions of Dracula from the 1920s, the movies also depict a monstrous count, like in 1922's Nosferatu. It's a far cry from what may automatically come to mind when you think Count Dracula. Like, if I asked you to dress up as Count Dracula for Halloween, what would you wear? Would you come as this, or something more like this? So why do we conjure up this more romanticized, sleek, and suave version of Count Dracula? Because Bram Stoker never wrote him that way. Vampires weren't meant to be attractive or the love interest. They were representative of death and disease. So at what point in his evolution did Dracula become classier, more refined, well-mannered, and with a distinct continental voice? It's all thanks to one man, an actor so defined by one role that the role became defined by him. His name was Bela Lugosi, and today we're looking at his incredible life, from obscure Hungarian stage actor to horror icon, death, and immortality. Bela Ferenc Dejeu Blasco was born on the 20th of October, 1882, in a town called Lugos, Hungary, in what is now modern-day Romania, about 400 kilometers from a little region you may have heard of called Transylvania. With little interest in academia, Bela dropped out of school at age 12, and he worked a succession of manual labor jobs. But his real passion was for the stage. At 6'1", Bela was tall and handsome, and at just 20 years old, he made his stage debut. For the next few years, he would take small roles in Hungarian provincial theater, and in 1903, he changed his name to Bela Lugosi. In his early days of Hungarian theater, Lugosi was considered a character actor, capable of Shakespeare, and considered the Hungarian John Barrymore. But like so many others, Lugosi's dreams were put on hold during World War I, when he was called upon to serve. He later recalled his time during the war, boasting to a colleague that he had been a hangman in the Hungarian army, but this wasn't true and was maybe just macabre bravado on the actor's part. Lugosi had, in fact, been an infantry captain, and he was wounded 3 times before an honorable discharge. After the war, Lugosi quickly returned to the stage, and he became a vocal union activist around the time of the Hungarian Revolution in 1919. Revolution was quickly followed by counter-revolution, and Lugosi was forced to flee Hungary for Austria and Germany. Lugosi landed in Berlin, where he would get a taste for the big screen, starring in at least 10 films, one of which was a collaboration with the legendary German auteur Friedrich Murnau. Lugosi didn't stay in Europe for much longer. After splitting from his first wife, he arrived in America in 1921 as a political refugee. First landing in New Orleans, he quickly made a beeline to New York and the draw of Broadway. At first, all that was available was work in off-Broadway Hungarian productions. His English was poor, almost non-existent, and when he eventually broke through and landed his first English-speaking part, he actually learnt his lines phonetically. This would continue to be an issue for Lugosi for a large part of his early film career. Although he would later learn to speak English fluently, his son, Bela Lugosi Jr., said his father never stopped thinking in Hungarian, and this led to an oddly inflected, deliberate style of speech, which would forever be associated with the Dracula character. Bram Stoker, a theater man at heart, had always envisioned his novel being adapted for the stage, but he never lived to see it. After his death in 1912, the rights to Dracula passed to his widow, Florence Stoker. Although allegedly never a huge fan of the novel, Florence Stoker did know its value, and she had been burned before. An unofficial, freely adapted German adaptation of Dracula had been released in 1922 through Prana Film. That was Friedrich Murnau's silent masterpiece, Nosferatu. This movie incensed Florence Stoker and resulted in years of legal wrangling, with the courts eventually ruling that all negatives of Nosferatu be destroyed. Fortunately, one copy did survive the wrath of Florence Stoker. Otherwise, this iconic film in the vampire zeitgeist may well have been wiped from history. There are varying accounts of how Lugosi landed the part of Count Dracula on Broadway. At the time, a variety of stage adaptations had been pitched, but somehow never materialized. One account is that Lugosi had been considered for one of these failed adaptations and had impressed enough to come to the attention of theater producer Horace Liverwright. But had Liverwright made the right casting decision? Because early rehearsals did not go well. Lugosi reportedly lacked the power and emotion for the role, and tensions were rising. Nearing crisis, Liverwright called for Lugosi to address his concerns, to which Lugosi replied in his slow, deliberate tone, "Mr. Liverwright, I understand your concern, but the performance is not until a week from tomorrow evening. Now we work for position. We save the atmosphere for a week from tomorrow evening." Lugosi's Count stood out. He brought a mysterious sexuality to the part, a presence that had been lacking in the novel. And it worked. Dracula became very popular, especially with female audiences. Lugosi received ardent, effusive fan mail from audience members who wanted him to turn them into vampires, who professed their love and desire not just for Bela, the actor, but for the character of Count Dracula himself. Clara Bow, the original Hollywood It Girl, was also a fan and could not wait to see the performance. A memoir written by a friend of Clara's reports that she was so excited she didn't even stop to dress. She just threw on a great long mink coat over her swimsuit and we got into her limousine. Clara was well-read on Lugosi. "I want to meet that man," she had said. And throughout the performance, Bow reportedly squirmed semi-nude under her fur and allegedly took Lugosi home that night, beginning a year-long romance. Lugosi, forever smitten with the Brooklyn bonfire, even commissioned a nude portrait of Bow, which he reportedly kept right up until his death. The next logical step for Dracula was the silver screen. Universal Studios were lucky enough to win the rights. Lugosi was desperate for the part and surely the obvious choice, but Universal thought differently. Lugosi wasn't a known name and had little film experience, at least in English. Their pick was character actor Lon Chaney, also known as the Man of 1,000 Faces. Chaney had made a name for himself as a monster specialist, even capable of applying his own grotesque makeup. Chaney had previously worked with Todd Browning, who had already been secured as Dracula's director. They had teamed up in 1927's London After Midnight, where Chaney had played a vampire-like character, complete with razor teeth, bulging eyes, and a top hat. But it wasn't to be. Universal's plans for a Lon Chaney Dracula were dealt a devastating blow on August 26, 1930, when Chaney passed away after suffering a throat hemorrhage. This sent Dracula casting into a tailspin, with many names being thrown into the hat. But Lugosi was still being sidelined. Universal were refusing to consider him, instead holding out for a bigger name. And Lugosi continued to lobby for the part. He even offered to help out in Universal's foreign language unit with Hungarian dubbing for their films, hoping that this good favor would be returned. But rather than boosting his favorability with Universal, Lugosi was just coming off as desperate, a position Universal were more than happy to exploit. Eventually, with just weeks to spare until the beginning of production, Universal offered the role to Lugosi, but on less than generous terms. Lugosi was offered just $500 a week for a 7-week shooting schedule. That's $3,500 for the title role in a major Hollywood production. Lugosi's co-star, David Manners, who played Jonathan Harker in the film, was paid 4 times that much. And this was only the beginning, just the first of many financial woes to come as Lugosi continued to navigate the choppy waters of the Hollywood studio system. But for now, he wasn't too concerned. He had the part, the role of a lifetime, a role that would go on to be both a gift and a curse for Bela Lugosi. Universal's Dracula is a movie of 2 parts. Act 1, is an eerie Gothic classic. The actor Dwight Frye's character Renfield arrives in Transylvania, a naive young solicitor from England who is sent to finalize the paperwork for Dracula's purchase of the fictional Carfax Abbey.
I am Dracula.
These sequences set in Transylvania still stand up today. They are legitimately creepy. They're surreal, and they feature outstanding performances from both Lugosi and Dwight Frye. Lugosi is a commanding figure with a presence that fills the entire frame. And his ability to transform from cordial, refined aristocrat to undead lord of darkness really demonstrates the range that he had as an actor. Equally, Frye's Renfield and his character's gradual decline into Dracula's fly-eating puppet is still unsettling.
Rat. 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 Ow.
And in comparison, the second act of the film is a bit of a letdown. The second half of the film shifts the action from Dracula's castle in Transylvania to the more sedate setting of Dr. Seward's residence in England. Scenes involving multiple characters would probably have benefited from close-ups or alternative shots, but instead, Browning favored a wide shot, meaning the audience loses subtleties in the performances, and some scenes appear unresolved. But in 1931, the film version of Dracula was a revelation. It outperformed almost everyone's expectations, and Universal Studios made a profit for the first time in 2 years, almost entirely on the strength of Dracula. In fact, it's generally acknowledged that the movie's success actually prevented Universal Studios from folding altogether. And moreover, Dracula helped solidify the American horror film as a distinct movie genre. For Lugosi, he'd finally achieved the stardom he had always craved. His continued lobbying of Universal had paid off, and the studio began to think of him as the new Lon Chaney.
Children of the night, what music they make.
But this career high wouldn't last very long. Universal's next project was another Victorian adaptation, this time Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and Universal had Lugosi in mind for the part of the monster. Lugosi, however, was less keen. Test footage was shot with the actor padded out in full monster garb and heavy makeup. His dialogue consisted of various moans and groans, and Lugosi hated the part. And now that he was a big star, he made sure Universal knew how he felt. He wanted the world to see his features and hear his voice, and Frankenstein's monster was not what he had in mind. Universal wouldn't listen to Lugosi's concerns or even offer him another role in the movie, instead opting to eject him from the project altogether. Enter Boris Karloff, who, like Lugosi before Dracula, was a relative unknown before being cast as Frankenstein's monster. Although an English actor, Karloff had mastered a wide range of accents and would often play an American. Karloff was also happy to sit for makeup and was generally just easier to deal with than the temperamental Lugosi. When Frankenstein was released, also in 1931, it became another mega hit for Universal, meaning Dracula hadn't been a fluke. Turns out, Depression-era America had a hunger for Gothic horror. So, hot on the latest trend, more Gothic Victorian adaptations were greenlit. Works by Edgar Allan Poe were quickly adapted, a film version of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde was produced at Paramount. Universal was very much at the center of this Gothic horror cinematic universe, if you will. And in Lugosi and Karloff, they had the two biggest names of the genre. Wanting to capitalize on their investments, Universal pitted the two giants of the Gothic era against one another in 1934's The Black Cat, very loosely based on an Edgar Allan Poe short story of the same name. It starred Lugosi not as the villain for once, but as the mysterious Dr. Vertigast, seeking revenge against Karloff's master architect Polzig, a fellow soldier who had left Lugosi's character for dead during the war. Lugosi and Karloff play off each other wonderfully, including a scene where the two horror titans play chess, almost like they're competing for the role of horror king. But by this stage, it actually wasn't really much of a competition. Karloff received top billing in the film, even though he has less screen time than Lugosi. And where Karloff was reportedly paid $7,500 for his role, Lugosi was allegedly paid just $3,000. That's less than what he was paid for Dracula back when he was still unknown. Lugosi and Karloff would team up 8 more times during their careers, each with Karloff receiving higher billing and a far larger paycheck. Now, whether there was ever actually any animosity between the two is doubtful. Regardless, the fact remains that if it weren't for Karloff and the success of Frankenstein, Lugosi probably would have been an even bigger star. The problem in the eyes of film producers was that Karloff could simply do more. He followed up Frankenstein with The Mummy. He could play a mobster, a scientist, a warlord. He wasn't tied down by the voice that became intrinsically linked to one role. Karloff was malleable. Lugosi was the Dracula guy, even when he wasn't trying to be. The meaty character roles and romantic leads that Lugosi sought always seemed to elude him. In 1932, he was considered for the part of Rasputin in the film Rasputin and the Empress, a role in which he could have excelled, but for which he was passed over. Inevitably, it wouldn't be long until he donned the cape once again for another Todd Browning picture, this time MGM's 1935 Mark of the Vampire. Lugosi would take on the role of Count Mora, a Dracula clone in everything but name. And in the short 4-year window between 1931's Dracula and 1935's Mark of the Vampire, Lugosi made his most successful movies at Universal, including Murders in the Rue Morgue, White Zombie, The Black Cat, and The Raven. The Raven was another film that brought Lugosi and Karloff together and is what sent censors into a panic. Its explicit themes of torture and experimentation actually helped introduce the Motion Picture Production Code. This new censorship legislation made it far harder for studios to release mainstream horror, and as a result, the gothic horror genre began to fizzle out. For an actor like Lugosi who was so entrenched in this particular genre, this sudden shift in moral standards made it way harder to find work. In 1937, the usually booked and busy Lugosi only starred in one film. And with horror suddenly in sharp decline, Lugosi lost his house, and he was forced to approach the Motion Picture Relief Fund when his son was born because he couldn't pay the hospital fees. But Lugosi's fortunes would change again when, in 1938, a new trend of rerunning Dracula and Frankenstein as a double bill would hit cinemas across the States. In a pre-television era, this meant that audiences could now sit through both iconic movies back to back, and the crowds were queuing around the block. Lugosi described this as a great comeback, seemingly missing the irony that said comeback was thanks to the role he was constantly trying to escape. With Dracula once again resurrected, Lugosi found himself back in work with a new Universal contract. And the studio was now attempting to cram as many icons into a single movie as possible. Frankenstein, Wolfman, and Dracula crossovers were very much the theme. But on the odd occasion that Lugosi was given something different to do, it often brought out the best in him as a performer. In 1939's Son of Frankenstein, he would play not the lead monster, but the demented assistant Igor. And Igor is arguably one of Lugosi's best performances ever.
They die dead. I die live.
He steals every scene as the broken-necked, snaggle-toothed companion to the monster. But unfortunately, this performance was widely ignored. And by 1943, Lugosi was back playing a vampire in Columbia Pictures' aptly titled Return of the Vampire. In vain, Lugosi looked for theater roles too. Something, anything to break the coffin-shaped mold he seemed to be forever trapped in. He changed agents frequently, but just like in Hollywood, there was only ever one role that theater producers wanted to see him perform, and every time on even lower and more insulting terms. Because Lugosi was never great with money, and studios were well aware of his financial difficulties, a fact that they were more than happy to take advantage of. He married and divorced several times, all while living a pretty lavish lifestyle. So when times inevitably got rough, Lugosi could always turn to Dracula for a quick buck. In total, he played Dracula in 17 different stage productions over a 24-year period. He would grow to hate the part, reportedly telling one of his agents, "No, not at any price. I hope to never hear of Dracula again. I cannot stand it. I do not intend that it shall possess me. No one knows what I suffer from this role." But over and over, once again desperate for work, reality would sink in and telegraphs would be sent out from his agents saying, "Yes, Mr. Lugosi is available for Dracula." And yes, on almost any terms. So once again, Lugosi returned to play Count Dracula in 1948's Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. This was Lugosi's last speaking part for a major studio because this time, Dracula was played for laughs. By the mid-1940s, Gothic horror had become passé. Just 15 years after this genre had helped create the motion picture production code, post-war America had now witnessed real horror on an industrial scale, and the quaint terror of the Count didn't have quite the bite it used to. True horror was now gargantuan. Movie screens filled with skyscraper scale stomping mutations hell-bent on citywide destruction. Radioactive lizards and monstrous bugs wreaked havoc across a modern, urbanized America, reflecting a real-world atomic fear. Horror movies would often take on a sci-fi spin in the 1950s, like an alien race had been sent to brainwash the masses, reflecting the other great fears of 50s America, communism and the Cold War. And by this point, the well-paid work had truly dried up for Lugosi. He was now reduced to the lowest of low-budget productions to scrape a living. Gone were the mansions and the lavish lifestyle. Lugosi was working just to survive. And it was during this period that he would strike up an unlikely relationship with a young, cross-dressing filmmaker from Poughkeepsie, New York, named Edward D. Wood, Jr. Ed Wood was keen for Lugosi to star in his debut picture, the semi-biographical Glenn or Glenda. In the film, Wood himself stars as the protagonist, Glenn, a man seeking acceptance from society for his unconventional habits. And Lugosi, rather out of context, plays a narrator-type figure who urges the audience to
Pull the string.
Lugosi went on to star in two further Ed Wood productions. One, Bride of the Monster, a Frankenstein-type story featuring Lugosi wrestling a rubber squid. And his final picture with Wood, the now infamous Plan 9 from Outer Space, a movie so famous for all the wrong reasons and which led to Wood being labeled the worst director in history. This period illustrates just how far Lugosi's stock had fallen and how desperate he had become for work. But even when he was scraping the bottom of the barrel, Lugosi was never phoning it in. He was committed to his performances, no matter the ridiculousness of the circumstances.
I will perfect my own race of people. A race of atomic supermen which will conquer the world.
Now an elderly man, Lugosi's health was also failing him. Throughout his life, he had actually suffered constant pain following injuries he sustained during his service in World War I, and in the decades that followed, he had developed an addiction to morphine. Paul Marco, his co-star on Bride of the Monster, recounts a harrowing visit to Lugosi's Hollywood apartment. Directly in front of me, there was a walk-in closet, and Bela pulled back the drapes, and I saw that it was like a small room. Bela took out an apron and wrapped it around himself very daintily and slowly tied a bow. Then he rolled his sleeves and washed his hands, took a clean towel from the drawer and wiped them dry. Then he opened the sterilizer and took out his hypodermic needle and his medicine. In April of 1955, Lugosi committed himself to a state hospital for treatment of drug addiction. He wasn't ashamed. In fact, he was one of the first Hollywood stars to publicly admit to visiting rehab. He was now a shell of his former commanding self. Upon leaving rehab, Lugosi reportedly weighed around 120 pounds and looked every one of his 72 years. While in rehab, Lugosi had received largely positive support from the public, and he even married for a 5th time. But a true comeback was never in the cards. On August 16, 1956, Lugosi died of heart failure. He was found in his Hollywood apartment clutching the latest script from Ed Wood, the script for a project called The Final Curtain. Thanks to studio exploitation, multiple divorces, and a lack of work throughout the 40s and 50s, Lugosi's estate at the time of his death was valued at less than $3,000 in total. Although at times he had grown to hate the part, Lugosi asked to be dressed as Dracula in his coffin. The Count was finally laid to rest in full ensemble: cloak, tuxedo, medallion, and blackened hair and eyebrows. Just why Lugosi requested this particular attire remains a bit of a mystery. Perhaps one final performance, or maybe Lugosi knew he would rise again in the afterlife. In a poetic mirroring of Dracula himself, interest in Lugosi came back to life almost immediately after his death. 52 pre-1948 classic horror films from Universal were released for television syndication. This late 50s revival gave rise to a new fan culture, mostly of pre-adolescent boys. This coincided with the rise of comic books, which were often themed around horror, monsters, and in particular, monsters of filmland. And once again, at the center of this revival were the twin characters of Dracula and Frankenstein. Curiously, it wasn't the wolf-like Bram Stoker Count or the otherworldly Nosferatu Count that was depicted, but instead, the tuxedo-wearing drawing room Count, first shown on the big screen back in 1931. In 1963, Lugosi's son, Bela Lugosi Jr., found a Count Dracula plastic model kit in a toy store. The packaging for this model carried his father's image. And it transpired that Universal had entered into various licensing arrangements using Lugosi's image. Lugosi Jr. soon learned that there was no end to the number of consumer products his father's image could enhance. And what resulted was a lawsuit in which the Lugosi estate would be rewarded $70,000 from Universal for the unauthorized use of Lugosi's image. What's perhaps more interesting is the use of Lugosi, the man, to sell products depicting a fictional character, Dracula. And in the same way that Lugosi had become Dracula, Dracula had now become Lugosi. He is the classic Count Dracula, the gold standard on which Dracula performances are based. Many great actors have gone on to play the Count after Lugosi, notably Christopher Lee. But in Lugosi, a marker was laid down. Like, if you asked a friend to do a Dracula voice, they'd probably do a Lugosi impression without even realizing they were. That's just what Dracula sounds like. And more than the voice, it was Lugosi who cemented the idea that Dracula could be more than a monster. He could be seductive. He allowed the audience to fantasize about a relationship with a vampire that went beyond the transaction of blood. And modern depictions of vampires put this idea front and center. In Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Buffy's love interest is Angel, a vampire. In the Twilight Saga, Bella Swan falls in love with a mysterious vampire, Edward Cullen, and it's she who pleads with Edward to turn her into a vampire, not the other way around. And for Lugosi, it was a bittersweet relationship with the role. For periods in his life, he hated Dracula and his constant association with it. He was looking to escape it. But when he was most in need of work, the Count was always there, like a shadowy alter ego from the dark side, ready to bail him out whenever he needed it. Maybe, if he had never been cast as Dracula, Lugosi could have gone on to be the famous character actor he always dreamed of being. But without Dracula, it's unlikely Lugosi would have the legacy he has now. And we probably wouldn't have the same popular idea of what a vampire looks and sounds like. I mean, who knows? Maybe if it hadn't been for Bela Lugosi bringing sex appeal to Dracula, Twilight would never have been born. Luckily for us, we'll never know. For many, consciously or subconsciously, Bela Lugosi in voice, in character, and in commanding presence is, and always will be, the classic Count Dracula. Thanks very much for watching, and we hope you enjoyed this video. We'd love to make more of these, so if you liked this episode and you want to see more, then like and subscribe to this channel, and let us know in the comments who you want to see us make a video about next.